In the grand, silent scheme of the universe, what is a life? A lone spark in the vast, dark immensity. And what is an entire civilization? An ephemeral constellation of these sparks, shining for a brief and glorious moment before inevitably being extinguished. For the millions of inhabitants of the city-state of Aethel, their history was the only history that mattered. Their gods, carved in stone and revered in marble temples, were the only true gods. Their lives, with their joys, sorrows, and routines, were the only conceivable reality. They were born, loved, fought, and died under a sky they believed to be infinite. Little did they know that their sky had a limit. Their reality was an exquisitely woven lie. Aethel, with its cobblestone streets, its imposing towers, and its vibrant citizens, was nothing more than a hyper-realistic simulation, a digital cage created by unknown entities for a purpose they could never even begin to fathom. They were lab rats on a cosmic scale, and their maze was civilization itself.
At the heart of this lie lived Kael, a man of facts, logic, and ink. As the head historian of the great archives of Aethel, he was the guardian of his people's collective memory. He believed the past was a book written in stone, immutable and absolute. But in recent cycles, the stones seemed to be cracking under his touch. He had begun to find inconsistencies, anomalies that defied all logic, historical records that contradicted themselves from one week to the next. Catastrophic events, like the Great Famine of Cycle 345, which he had studied for years, would suddenly vanish from the annals, replaced by records of an era of unprecedented prosperity. It was as if an invisible hand was dipping into the past and rewriting history, erasing the pain and struggle of his people, smoothing out the rough edges of reality.
His obsessive search for answers led him to the dark alleys and silent taverns where dissident thinkers gathered. They were outcasts, labeled as mad by Aethel's orderly society. It was in this underworld of forbidden ideas that he found Lyra, an artist whose soul seemed tuned to a different frequency from the rest of the world. Her canvases did not depict the serene landscapes or noble portraits that adorned the halls of the elite. Lyra painted glitches. She captured fleeting moments of dissonance, a sky that seemed to tear in geometric patterns, faces whose features dissolved into digital static, a tree whose texture seemed unfinished. They were glimpses of a world behind the world.
The confirmation of his most terrifying suspicions came on an afternoon of abnormally clear skies. A storm emerged from nowhere, a meteorological anomaly that defied the predictions of the sages. A bolt of lightning, a sickly violet color, descended from the heavens and struck the central square. But there was no deafening sound of thunder, nor an explosion of stone and dust. Instead, a profound silence fell over the city. And for a single, eternal second, reality unraveled. The blue sky transformed into a black, checkered grid, stretching into an artificial infinity. The buildings around them flickered, their solid stone facades revealing a skeletal structure of glowing green wire beneath. The world became a digital architectural blueprint. And then, coming from everywhere and nowhere, they heard the voice. Calm, devoid of emotion, clinical. A voice that did not belong to their world.
The world snapped back to normal in the blink of an eye. The sky was blue again. The stone was solid. But the image of that digital grid was seared into the minds of Kael, Lyra, and Joric, a pragmatic ex-soldier who accompanied them. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen. They were not children of Aethel, blessed by benevolent gods. They were prisoners in a cage of data, and their gods were their jailers. The initial shock gave way to an icy wave of rage, and finally to a determination forged in fire. Gathered in the damp, dusty basement that served as Lyra's studio, the small band of rebels began to formulate a plan that bordered on insanity.
They would fight, but how do you fight an enemy that can rewrite reality, that can cure a plague or create a deluge with a simple command? How do you challenge a god who can simply decide to erase you from existence? The plan that emerged was audacious and desperate. They would not fight with swords and shields, but with the very logic of the system. If Aethel was a program, then it must have rules, limits, vulnerabilities. They would use the gods' own tools against them. By creating chaotic and unpredictable events at key points across the city, they hoped to force a system overload, a cascading failure so massive it would expose the fundamental structure of the simulation. Perhaps, just perhaps, this failure could reveal an exit. It was a declaration of war, a revolt not of armies, but of chaos and information. The rebellion began with the first rays of dawn, painting the simulated sky in shades of orange and pink. Joric, using his knowledge of engineering and military tactics, led a team to sabotage the Great Aqueduct. They didn't destroy it, but reversed the flow of its massive pumps, sending millions of liters of water back into the commercial district. It wasn't a flood to kill, but to destabilize, to force the system to recalculate and divert resources. Simultaneously, on the rooftops of the city, Lyra's followers, artists and dreamers, orchestrated a symphony of visual chaos. Using an arsenal of polished crystals, mirrors, and intense light sources, they projected the glitches Lyra saw on a grand scale. The sky above Aethel began to flicker, revealing the black grid behind it. The facades of buildings melted into waterfalls of green code. Chaos was their weapon, and the city was their canvas.
The citizens' reaction was a mixture of panic and awe. Thousands saw the sky unravel and fell to their knees, praying to gods who, for the first time, remained silent. Others, however, saw the truth in those disturbing images, the confirmation of a suspicion that had always lived in the back of their minds, and they joined the revolt. Meanwhile, Kael positioned himself at the city's neural hub, the clock tower. Using a modified device, he hijacked all communication channels, his voice echoing from every loudspeaker, every transmission device in Aethel. The world around them began to succumb to entropy. Colors faded to a monochromatic gray. The sounds of the city merged into a high-pitched, constant electronic hum. The people, both the loyal and the rebels, began to dissolve, their physical forms disintegrating into clouds of golden light particles. The reset was cleansing the system.
But at the top of the clock tower, where the bronze hands spun wildly backward, the system overload triggered an unexpected effect. Where there had once been only stone, a fissure began to open. It wasn't a door of wood or metal, but a tear in the very fabric of reality, bleeding a pure, blinding white light. Through this rift, they glimpsed another place, a sterile, cold laboratory illuminated by screens and holograms. Tall, slender figures in white lab coats moved in panic. their alien faces twisted in shock as they stared at a giant monitor displaying a single word in red: error. Kael, Lyra, and Joric looked at each other one last time. The air of their world vibrated with the imminence of oblivion. Behind them, Aethel, their home, their prison, was being erased. Ahead, an unknown reality, cold, and perhaps infinitely more dangerous, awaited them.
They were no longer characters in a controlled story. They were the authors of their own uncertain destiny. Without hesitation, driven by a mixture of fear and hope, they ran toward the light, not as obedient simulations, but as conscious, free beings. The revolt of the simulations did not end with the clamor of victory, but with the silence of an escape. They had broken out of the cage, only to discover that the universe was vastly larger and stranger than they could ever have dreamed. They did not know what awaited them on the other side of that portal of light, whether they would be hunted as anomalies, studied as specimens, or find allies in their struggle. Perhaps they had merely traded one prison for another. But one thing was undeniably certain: they were free. And for the first time in their entire existence, the future was not written.